So overall, we can see relatively gross disparities and where each country relies in relation to global totals, and we can see that in terms of all of the indicators that for example, the United States um, has over 4 times the amount of GNI in terms of schooling overall. The United States has about 5 more years in terms of mean years of schooling. And in terms of life expectancy in the United States, about 10 more years of life overall within the United States. And this is important to think about the inequalities that exist between countries. Um, and indeed, within countries, there can be a fair amount of inequality as well. And this is measured by the Gini coefficient, which looks at income distribution in country. And relative inequality is score, the highest would be 100 on the Gini score. The best you can get is closer to 0. And you can see from both the map here as well as a more defined chart from the Human Development Report in 2004 that in fact the world in terms of in-country inequality is about 67 overall. And then this chart, it divides it by country or region. So you see South Asia, the OECD countries, such as the United States, Eastern Europe, and the Commonwealth of Independent States, East Asia and the Pacific, Latin America and the Caribbean. Overall, the world, you can see, is more on average in terms of inequality, and then sub-Saharan Africa being the site of some of the grossest in-country inequality overall. And you can see the United States, where the United States ranks overall between Vietnam and Kenya. And you can see Sweden is probably ranking the best here with the lowest Gini coefficient score overall in terms of income distribution. Income inequality across the globe is fairly dramatic. The richest 5% of the world's people receive more than 100 times the income of the poorest 5%, while the richest 1% receives more income than the poorest 50% of the world's people. In 1820, Western Europe's per capita income was only about 3 times that of Africa's. However, by 1992, Western Europe's per capita income was 13 times that of Africa's. So fairly dramatic increase in inequality over time. According to reports from the United Nations, Human Development Reports, and social indicators, more equal societies tend to fare better in a host of social measures than more unequal societies. We see 1.5 billion people living relatively well-off, middle-class lives and above across the globe, while at the same time we see 1 billion people living in abject poverty, earning less than $1 a day. This is for the UN. This is what is known as extreme poverty. Another billion, however, earn less than $2 a day, which is enough to escape starvations, but not enough to move out of poverty. It's defined by the United Nations as moderate poverty overall. So I hope this gives a global perspective on the issue of income and wealth inequality. From here, I'd like to move to looking at wealth inequality in the United States. And there's a film that's on Bolt that you guys should check out on wealth inequality in the United States, and it discusses what individuals think, what Americans think the ideal distribution, what it actually is, and then how individuals would perceive an ideal distribution where you don't see a complete sharing of wealth across the board, but rather a more equitable distribution of income overall. And indeed, we can see that there's been a lot of talk about the richest and the 1%, and a lot of critiques of this overall. So you can see a tremendous amount of wealth that's in the hands of relatively few individuals. In terms of net worth, these are the world's billionaires here, list of the top 25 billionaires across the globe. So again, tremendous amount of wealth, tremendous amount of investments that individuals have, as well as potentially higher income earning opportunities overall. There's been, with the Occupy movement in the United States, there's been the 99% movement, or the Occupy movement, and a number of tools that get to what percent individuals are. This is the Wall Street Journal's report. If you click on the link for the lecture, it'll take you to the Wall Street Journal website, where it will essentially give you information on what percent you are based on income. I believe that the 1%, the top tier, if your income is over $500,000 a year, about $520,000, that would put you in the 1%. Now, certainly, it's difficult to imagine any sort of class consciousness along the lines of, for example, this woman here who is talking about paying off loans, using food stamps, and taking care of children, and how she might align with someone who's making $500,000 a year. But according to the dictates of the 99% movement, these individuals would all be in the same boat, or have the same sort of class consciousness in line with Marx. We can certainly argue about whether that's the case or not. Indeed, there's been critiques of the 99% movement and the so-called 53% movement, which discusses the notion of individual hard work and labor, non-union labor, as essentially getting by and prospering within the current economic system as a whole. We can see that in the United States, and this comes from the Congressional Budget Office, that there have been some fluctuations with overall income, average after-tax income in the United States, and with recessions, the relative downturn and the spikes in relative wealth of individuals in relation to one another. What's interesting to look at too is how U.S. consumer spending has been influenced by what some have referred to as the Great Recession, 2008. And we see increase in many things across the board, as well as potential decreases in spending in other places, such as gasoline, household furnishing, new cars and trucks, versus car maintenance, where you're going to try to maintain and take care of what you have. And again, I think this is important to point out, because over and over, when you talk to, when Americans have been surveyed about what they perceive as valuable, they'll often talk about family, friends, and relationships within the community. And many social commentators noted that with the downturn in the economy, individuals were reprioritizing these types of relations and not necessarily spending money as a whole. We can see that economic distribution in terms of net worth and financial wealth is rather confined, with the top 1%, which many have critiqued, occupying 35% of the nation's net worth and 42% of the financial wealth. The next 4%, which under the dictates of the 99% movement, many would say, would say that this is part of the 99%. However, we can see that they also, along with the 1% in total here, over 70% of the financial wealth and over 60% of the net worth. The key here, I think, what the movement is really getting at maybe is this bottom 80%, with relatively small financial wealth and very small net worth overall for 80% of the population. In terms of economic recovery, this is from the Pew Research Center. It has showed that households that are in the wealthiest 7% have fared much better in terms of the recovery. the supposed recovery between 2009 and 2011 post-recession, that in terms of net worth of households has gone down in the lower 93%. The Pew report suggests that this has to do with many having much of their wealth tied up in real estate and the lack of recovery of the real estate market in many markets across the country, whereas the wealthiest 7% have seen a 28% increase in their overall net worth over time. And this has led to a larger percentage of the aggregate wealth in the upper or the wealthiest 7% of the population. And so we might start to think about the 99% movement and whether maybe the 93% movement or something like that might make a little bit more sense politically overall. A few of you looked at the credit card in the history of the world and noted the idea of access to credit, and the access to credit as being something that's valuable for an individual living in contemporary society. And in his work on the precipice of debt, Brett Williams talks about the notion of debt, and indeed the particularly payday lenders, and how individuals with lower credit are often get put into these cycles of debt in an under-regulated loan market where they might pay up to 400% annual interest rates on short-term loans. And we can see here, of course, the targeting of many of these payday loan centers is in communities which are not as well off or not as affluent as other communities, which would have access to other sources of credit overall, either credit card or bank or credit union loan as a whole. Brett Williams notes that it can be that individuals paying on a $300 loan will have to pay $45 every 2 weeks to float a cash advance of $255 just to keep a loan out of default. The average borrower pays back $793 on a $300 loan. So it's you can see these fees, the interest rates, and the doubling catches up very quickly to individuals who utilize payday loans, which are essentially garnished from paychecks of individuals. And there's also the potential to not only garnish borrowers' wages, but also potentially press criminal charges for writing hot checks or checks that cannot be cashed in order to cover the interest rate. And so these are certainly areas that Williams has looked at in terms of looking at income inequality and its long-term ramifications for entering into consumer exchanges, including things like paying for necessary means of everyday physical as well social biological reproduction. Peoples in 2010 piece looks at, in the annual review of anthropology, looks at the anthropology of credit and debt in a cross-cultural perspective, and notes that anthropologists as a whole have refused to segregate the moral from the material world in the context of the economy. These are rather co-constitutive of one another, and that creditors are viewed in cross-cultural perspective and historically as both good as well as a hazard, and debtors, which are seen as potentially bad or beneficial. Peoples makes reference to Mauss's notion of the gift, where credit and debt greatly contribute to the building of hierarchy as well as dominance within society, and goes to Murphy and Stewart's work in 1946, where needs were essentially created in order to reduce the need for new debts. And this, once the trading systems enter into the fore in fur trading, and you have company stores and whatnot, there's this deliberate design for so-called Indians to buy beyond their means at these trading outposts. Peebles notes that anthropology